Okay, good
Welcome
afternoon.
back once again at a very interesting session addressed by Mr. R.C. Bhargava, IAS Chairman, Maruti Suzuki India Limited, on the Maruti story, lessons for the revival of manufacturing in Eastern India. The session will be moderated by Dr. Shiladitya Chatterjee, member of the Economic Affairs Committee, BCCNI, and former member of Indian Administrative Service and Asian Development Bank. We are really honored for your acceptance to join us as our speaker, sir. I will now hand it over to Dr. Chatterjee. If you may kindly take the session forward. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Arnav. Very good afternoon to our audience from Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Thank you for joining our e-conclave on Bengal Economy 2021. As Arnav mentioned, we have a very interesting session with one of the leaders in Indian industry with us, Mr. R.C. Bhargav, Chairman of Maruti Suzuki India Limited, is very well known. Everybody knows about him, and so therefore there's no need to introduce him again. Thank you, sir, again for being with us and sharing your vast knowledge and experience with us. Mr. Bhargav will speak on the Maruti story, lessons for the revival of industry in Eastern India. After his talk, which will be around half an hour, we will have about 10 minutes for questions. So with this, sir, very short introduction, over to you, sir.
Thank you, Shiladitya, and a very good afternoon to the audience and all of you there. It's a real honor to be invited by the Bengal Chamber of Commerce and Industry to speak today at this e-conclave. And I've been asked to share my thoughts on how the Maruti experience can help in reviving the industrial manufacturing growth of the Eastern region. I'll share my thoughts, though I must warn you that reviving manufacturing is not at all a simple task. And certainly the Maruti experience will not be sufficient to revive the manufacturing growth in this area. It requires a lot of political willpower, it requires political understanding, it requires administrative understanding, it requires entrepreneurs to have a mind change on how and what they want to do. So despite that, I'll make an effort and tell you what I, during my 65 years of working in the IAS, BHEL, and Maruti, have learned and what insights I've got into policy making and what is my understanding of why industry has failed to grow in India as was planned and needed. It is a fact that since 1947, all governments have wanted to industrialize India, create employment, eradicate poverty and deprivation, and usher in a socialistic society. These objectives have not changed, and looking at the Indian environment, the social conditions, the political conditions, the economic conditions, these goals are obviously the right goals for India. But it is also indisputable that despite every government wanting to achieve these objectives, over a period of 70 years, no government has actually succeeded in achieving this object, creating an equitable social society in India, which is access to all the necessities of life, and that we are a country where people want to invest in India. So it's something which I think a lot of people want answers to. Why has this happened? And why India, with all the advantages which we had in 1947 when we got independence, where we were much ahead of almost every Southeast Asian country, we have still failed to achieve what we set out to achieve. Now, we all know that for a company to grow, it is necessary that the market size for its products should keep increasing steadily. That would happen if consumers found that the company gave good value for its products, value for money, meaning that the quality and the price of the products was something which the consumer liked and which he wanted to buy, and the number of consumers kept increasing every year. At the same time, this selling price, which gives good value to the buyer, should also result in the company making adequate profits so that it could generate internal resources to fund expansion of capacity, technology, development, and other necessary investments. Now, the market size for a product can be both domestic and in foreign countries. The domestic market size would be determined to a large extent by the cost of the product which the manufacturer makes, and then the cost which is added on before the product reaches the consumer. These costs, beside transportation and other costs, include the taxes levied both by the central and the state governments. And if the net result is that the price to the consumer is such a price that the number of consumers who can buy that product at that price is limited and increasing slowly, then the domestic market size for that company would also increase slowly. If you are looking at the other part of the market, which is the external market in foreign countries, then to sell in any foreign country, your price has to compete with products made in other countries, which means your product must, in terms of price and in terms of quality, be as good, if not better, than products made in other countries. The quality today in today's world is almost a given. You can't even think of selling in the market if your quality is poor. Therefore, the primary requirement of being competitive in foreign markets is the ability to produce the required quality, but at a minimal price. The fact that the companies in India have not grown is because the price at which a consumer gets the product in the domestic market has not been a price which has enabled the consumer market in India to grow at anything near a high enough rate. And please remember that an industry cannot grow faster than demand grows, because you can only grow and manufacture products which you can sell. If there is no market for it, if there's no demand for it, you can't keep producing and find warehouses to stock it. So domestic market becomes restricted because of what I just said. The foreign markets, we have not been competitive at all in terms of price and cost, and so they have not grown. And because industries have not grown in India, India has not been a country which has attracted more and more investment in manufacturing and industry, because if the existing industries themselves are not doing well, not growing, not making profits, not generating internal resources, why would somebody come from anywhere else and invest in this country? And I think this is something which needs to be understood, that if you want foreign investment in manufacturing, or even if you want more Indian companies to invest, whether it's in the eastern region or any other part of the country, then the demand for the products must be seen as one which will increase fast enough to justify those investments being made. And we have not been able to do that. Now, I mentioned about companies generating internal resources and making profits. Unfortunately, we have confused the requirements of industrial growth with socialism. Over a long period of time, we have actually from the beginning, we have thought that making profits was anti-socialistic, was a means of exploiting the poor consumers, and companies should not make profits or make minimal profits so that the poor people in the country got products at a low price. Especially in the public sector, this pricing policy has often been followed. But the result of this was that there was no internal resource generation, no money to put for expansion, modernization, even for adequate maintenance. Technology development did not take place because there was no money to invest in making large R&D, besides which it was not really required. Let me say that Maruti, and this is giving you an example to see what happens when internal resources are generated. Maruti from the beginning, and Mr. Osamu Suzuki, the president of Suzuki, from the beginning has insisted that the company must reduce costs and make adequate profits. Now, nobody can accuse Maruti of profiteering. Our profits, our prices of cars have been probably the lowest of all other car manufacturers. It has been a competitive market. But despite keeping the lower prices, we have grown from the initial 100,000 car project which the government sanctioned and gave money to a capacity of 1.5 million cars today with only internal resources. We have no borrowings, and the equity capital of the company, which was originally 80 crores when we started, increased over these years to 150 crores because Suzuki's share went up. So there was hardly any increase. But from 100,000 capacity, we are 15 times that capacity. We've got a big infrastructure within the company and outside for marketing and sales and various other things. And after all of that, we today have over 40,000 crores in cash. So it just shows that if you run an efficient company, well managed, and focus on frugal management, don't waste money, then you can generate a lot of internal resources. Unfortunately, Indian companies, barring a few exceptions, have not done that. And that has been one of the factors why industry have not grown. You were keen on the eastern region. Please look at the balance sheets of companies in that area and see how many are generating internal resources. If they're not generating internal resources, why would anybody come and invest in that area? So you have to find a way by which the company can keep down its costs of manufacture, look at the taxation on the product so that the domestic market can grow, and change the attitude towards profit making as long as the company retains those profits in the company itself and uses it for further growth and betterment of the company. If the company management takes out the money and spends it on various lavish consumptions, that is, of course, not the objective. Now, I talked to the public sector. Till 1991, the public sector was required to drive industrial growth in the country. But no policy maker and no policy ever required the public sector to reduce costs and become profitable. They did not generate internal resources. And because of the lack of competition and therefore the lack of attention to quality and cost, the products of the public sector were also not competitive, and it led to other industries becoming not non-competitive. Many public sector companies require government support even today. They don't generate internal resources. The Modi government has started a bigger drive to privatize public sector companies. I'm not sure how quickly this will be actually implemented. And because I think there's a lot of political opposition also to privatization of public sector companies, because somehow we seem to think that running inefficient companies which do not create wealth is a good way to have socialism. I'm not sure how people can become rich by distributing poverty. But that is the kind of approach we have followed, where we don't worry about generating wealth, but want to create property. The private sector was allowed to grow only after 1991. And while many restrictions were removed, many of the policies and the approach to the private sector did not change, because the thinking which prevailed prior to 1991 remained after 1991 also. Socialism remained a goal. And therefore, the private sector was really not trusted, and profit making became difficult, doing business was difficult. The result is that even till today, the share of manufacturing in the GDP has remained between 14 and 16%. It has not grown. Probably the reason why these policies were followed from 1950 and was 1950 was because we decided to follow the Soviet example of how planning should be done and how policies should be made. But what is surprising is that when we found after 8, 10, 12, 15 years that these policies were not delivering the results we wanted, nobody thought of making any changes in these policies, or if they thought, the political system or the administrative system didn't allow these changes to be made. And we continue to believe, and still have this, a lot of people still believe, that public sector brings in socialism and serves a public good. I am hard-pressed to understand how that happens. Now, lowering costs of manufacturing is something I mentioned earlier, is a key factor to becoming competitive and selling more products in the market. Many reforms have been made. Ease of doing business brings down the cost of manufacture. But why does that remain high? Because even now, even the Modi government has not been able to change the basic approach where industrial policies were mixed with socialistic policies. And the idea was that by doing this combined policy making for bringing in socialism and industrial development, we will be able to bring in socialism. It was thought that industrialists, being rich people, will be able to afford the higher costs of imports and various infrastructure items and other things, and therefore that extra money could be used for socialism. It doesn't happen that way. Your products become high cost, the industry doesn't grow, employment doesn't get created, you don't get socialism. Now, government itself, central government itself, cannot make industries competitive. I think it's important to understand that much the larger interaction of any industry and most of the factors which add to higher costs are incurred because of the interaction with the state governments. The higher cost of inputs, which I'm talking about, the higher costs of infrastructure, which I'm talking about, the higher cost of compliance with the numerous state laws which exist everywhere, are all because of state laws, not because of central laws. And I think it would be, if the Eastern region wants to grow, they have to understand that the bulk of what requires to make industry come to the Eastern region lies in the hands of the state governments of the Eastern region. It lies in the hands of the administrative officers and the entire administrative machinery of the Eastern region. It does not lie with the central government or anybody else outside. And secondly, if therefore you want to do it, you have to look at all policies. Do they promote lower cost industrialization, manufacturing? Do they lead to higher cost? Is it serving the purpose of manufacturing development if industry is asked to pay twice the normal cost for electricity? Does it help if infrastructure provided to industry is lowest priority in terms of all, whether it's pricing or anything else, than to others? Can we subsidize the poorer people by making the cost of manufacturing higher? That's the fundamental question. And the answer is that if you use industry to subsidize the poorer people, the product will not sell, industry will not grow. So you can't do it that way. You have to make industry grow. You have to create employment. You have to get the economy going. And from the incomes which come to the government, then you provide the social services. Now, how does government further delay business? Government has never recognized the importance of time. And whether it is in making payments to private business, whether it is in interaction with private business, the time taken is much, much too long if you compare with most of the countries which have grown and developed in the past decades in the Asian region. And I think if one of the factors, therefore, which we need to look at, if industry is going to become more competitive and people are going to come, is that both at the political level and at the administrative level, it has to be recognized that time is an extremely costly and valuable input for industry. And unless everybody understands the importance of time and therefore of acting as felicitators of industry, not as regulators or controllers, of not thinking that by allowing some law to be implemented and giving permission under that law, you're doing a favor. You're not going to get competitive manufacturing happening. So, and as I said, this all what I'm talking about is all within the hands of the state administration. Labor laws. Labor is an extremely important input for manufacturing. A manufacturing company has maybe 70% of its employees who are workers. Now, a management, of course, has to handle labor, but the government should not create situations where labor feels that it can disregard whatever the management says, and there will be somebody somewhere to bail them out because they are large numbers and they are a vote bank of some sort. So I think some of these approaches have to change. The mental attitude has to change towards the industry and all that goes into it. Look at all the rules and regulations. And look at the taxes. Try and bring down the cost to the consumer so that demand for the product goes up. That is fundamental for industrial growth. Industry themselves, industrialists themselves, is not, I'm not trying to say that industrialists are not to blame for what has happened. Far from it. It's been, what should I say, an interactive process. Government has created some conditions, the industry has taken advantage of those conditions or reacted to those conditions, and various bad practices have gone up. And today, if industry in India is going to become competitive and grow, it is necessary that industrialists win back the trust of the people. They have to comply with tax laws. They have to give up black money use. They have to give up ostentatious consumption. And they have to work and operate their companies in the interests of all the stakeholders. And stakeholders includes all the employees, and not in the interests only of themselves and their families. I think this change in the attitude of industrialists are also very much required. They have to adopt management practices like we did when we started in Maruti. We found that the Japanese system, where they built a relationship of trust and confidence with the labor, and labor became partners in the company, was the most effective way of overcoming many of the handicaps that Japan faces. And today, that is the same condition in India. If industrialists really want the industry to grow and become competitive and the state governments to help, they have to understand that they cannot operate in the way they have been operating. They must build a much more partnership relationship with the workers and help them, look after them well, and not leave them to the mercies of the unions who have other interests, but treat them as part of their own family and treat them as such. So I've just run out of my half an hour. And therefore, my conclusion is that if state governments, whether it's in the eastern region or any other part of the country, want to create a more congenial climate for industrialization and manufacturing, if as a result of that they want to create employment, employment is created not only in manufacturing, but a whole lot of the service sector jobs. If you look at service sector jobs, you'll understand that most service sector jobs owe their origin to manufacturing. The more manufacturing activity, the more downstream activities, therefore, the more will be the employment in the social sector, in the services sector. And therefore, if you really want to develop the economy, you have to develop manufacturing. It cannot happen otherwise in a large populated country like India. And to make that happen, manufacturing has to become low cost, and consumer must get goods at a price which they can afford. There's nothing like luxury goods, demerit goods, merit goods. It doesn't make sense. You want all goods to be produced and sold, and they should be saleable. If you do that, I think we can still recover the decades we have lost and industrialize a region or the country. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, sir. That was extremely interesting, and you provided a very broad discussion about the manufacturing and the prospects of manufacturing, not only in India, but also specifically Eastern India. I particularly liked, amongst the things that you spoke of, I liked the point that you made about internal resources, for example. which is something which companies are not doing in India in general. And I suppose the same applies to Eastern India. Also, you mentioned that about frugal management and the need to cut costs to generate internal resources. Also, you mentioned about the Japanese method which you have worked with, and that has a huge kind of a lesson for us. And I particularly liked your discussion on how you manage the labor and management relations. This is a very, very important issue for West Bengal particularly, and for the eastern region, where we've had this kind of a conflict situation between labor and capital. And this is something which you have resolved through this Japanese method, which I think has major lessons for us. You also mentioned about the importance of the state governments. Now, we always say, okay, central governments are not doing enough for us. But what are the state governments doing? And the state, and the fact that the states have even probably, as you mentioned, a bigger role to play in generating and helping generate manufacturing is, I think, an important issue that needs to be taken into account. And the fact that delays and time taken for approvals and so on are very critical for manufacturing. And also, you made the point, we always think of bypassing manufacturing, for example, in Eastern India and going to services. And you made the very good point that if you do not have manufacturing and you do not have industry, then you cannot have services actually. So it's basically, we have to delve into the problem of manufacturing. So that is what I took from here, but I am now waiting for some questions. Okay, I have one question for Mr. Bhargav, which has come in. Would you or any investor like to invest in manufacturing facility in a place where local government is in continuous loggerhead with central government on almost all fronts? So what the question is asking is, the central-state relations must be good for manufacturing. What is your take on this, sir?
Frankly, I don't think it matters if the state government and the central government are at loggerheads, as long as the state government does what it should do to make manufacturing competitive in the state. Because the being at a political loggerhead with the central government will not affect the working of an industry in any state at all.
Okay. This question came from a person in Goa, actually. Now, I have a question from one Mr. Sushim Banerjee, and he has asked, what do you think is the future of electrical vehicles in India? What is the future, and can we generate a large proportion of electrical vehicles from the
electrical vehicles?
Yes.
Well, we need to get to cleaner modes of transportation. I think there's no disputing that. Electric vehicles in India have a number of problems at the moment, which makes it difficult for them to be accepted by the consumer in any kind of numbers. The cost of the vehicles. It's easy for a consumer in the United States or in Europe, where the per capita income is $40,000, $60,000, to buy a vehicle which costs, let's say, $28,000, $25,000, $30,000. The same consumer in India has a per capita income of $2,000. How does he buy a vehicle costing the same amount? And India is, as you know, a small car manufacturing country where the bulk of the customers use small cars because they can't afford the bigger cars, for one. The infrastructure doesn't permit it either. And a small car becomes far too costly for them to afford. So electrification will come, but I believe initially it will come with the upper end of the market, which is a smaller part of the market. It will not come down to the lower side, the 70% of market is small cars. It will not come to this segment until technology changes and improves to allow electric vehicles to be affordable. Infrastructure is the next point, which is yet to be built. And in the meantime, the optional technologies which are available and which are being used, like CNG or hybrids, which will come in bigger measure. Today, the hybrids are not given any encouragement by the government because they are taxed like any ordinary car. Although they reduce fuel consumption by anything from 20 to 35%, but no concession in GST is made for that. And therefore, hybrids don't sell very much. They also become too expensive for people to afford. So this affordability factor is, I think, not understood by most policymakers in this country, that you can copy the Western countries and their standards. But if the result of that is high cost, it will only shrink the market in India. It will not introduce that technology in large measure in India.
Thank you, sir. This is a question from Mr. Sumit Bose, the president of our Economic Affairs Committee. And he asked, he was also former Finance Secretary, Government of India, sir. He says, do you see the production-linked incentives announced by the government succeeding in boosting manufacturing?
PLI?
Yes.
The PLI scheme. PLI scheme has value for certain types of industries and certain manufacturing activities. But the PLI scheme cannot compensate for the lack of competitiveness of industry in general. If you want manufacturing industry to grow, more investments to be made, and the contribution of manufacturing to go up from the 14-16% to 25%, you need to make manufacturing as a whole much more competitive. The PLI doesn't remove the obstacles to competitive manufacturing.
Okay. One last question, sir. And this is asking you whether you would think that Maruti can invest, it's an obvious question, in Eastern India and particularly West Bengal, whether it would ever think about that right now. Why it will and why it will not?
At the moment, we are not looking at any site anywhere because we have enough capacity. The market for cars is growing very slowly. In the last 5 years, and I'm excluding the COVID years, last year and this year, the growth of the compound annual growth of car sales in India was 1.3%. Now, if industry is growing at that rate, why would somebody create large capacities anyway? We are looking at the existing Gurgaon plant has to shift because this has become in the center of habitation. So that will lead to a new site where we'll make investments. But that has to be close by because of labor and other considerations, the suppliers and labor. And we have spare land in Gujarat at the moment. So unless growth in India picks up sharply, the question of investing in other parts of India just doesn't arise at this point of time.
What about India participating in auto components as part of value chains internationally?
The auto component industry actually has done quite well. Today, the exports of auto components are about $12 billion. And many of them are supplying to international companies. But it is still a small fraction of the international trade in auto components. And the same issues come up here of quality and cost.
Very good, sir. I think we've run out of time. Those were extremely important and good insights. And there are a lot of things that we can take from this session. Again, thank you on behalf of Bengal Chamber and all of us. Thank you very much, sir. And
Thank you all very much for patiently listening to what I have to say.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
And
sir.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. With this, we are concluding the session. We are honored for the presence of Mr. R.C. Bhargava, IAS Chairman, Maruti Suzuki India Limited. And the next session will be starting panel discussion on industry and trade, growth trajectory of Bengal. We have very eminent speakers with us, and we will start it exactly at 4 p.m. Till then, stay tuned. We will come back again at 4:20 p.m. Thank you.